there's a specific kind of silence that follows a joke at your expense. Not the silence of shock, not the silence of anger. It's quieter than both. A half-second pause where everyone in the room decides, together, without speaking, whether to acknowledge what just happened or let it dissolve into laughter. They let it dissolve. Daniel let it dissolve too. He'd gotten good at that. He'd been with Nadia for 11 months. Long enough to know her coffee order, her mood by the way she texted, the specific way she went quiet when she was calculating something, rather than feeling it. Long enough to have loved her in that deep, inconvenient way that doesn't ask permission before arriving. Long enough, he realized later, to have missed the pattern entirely. Looking back, and he would spend several days looking back, the way you retrace a route after getting lost. The signs had never been hidden. They had simply been things he chose to translate generously. When she avoided the topic of her parents, he called it privacy. When she introduced him to colleagues but never childhood friends, he called it timing. When she laughed more freely around others, louder with a different quality to it, something looser and less careful, he told himself it meant she was comfortable enough around him to be quieter. He had been, he understood now, a very creative interpreter. The dinner had been her idea. 4 of her friends, a restaurant she liked, in the kind of neighborhood where the lighting is deliberately too dim. Daniel had arrived on time, ordered water, and spent the first 40 minutes in that particular social position of someone who knows one person at a table of 5 present, but slightly adjacent, engaged, but never quite centered. He hadn't minded. He was good with people. He asked questions, remembered names, laughed at the right moments. Nadia, across from him, was in full form, animated, warm. The version of herself she saved for audiences. He had loved watching her be that way once. He wasn't sure when that changed. The comment came during a lull. One of her friends, Priya, was talking about a cousin's engagement, something about how the families had met, the logistics of introductions. And then Nadia, without looking at Daniel, laughed in that light, dismissive way she had and said it. "What do you think? That I'd ever introduce you to my parents?" The table caught it. He saw it move across their faces. A flicker of discomfort in Priya's eyes, a careful neutrality from the others. Someone reached for their drink. Daniel smiled. Not a wounded smile, not a performance of composure. Something simpler than that. A smile that belonged to a person who had just understood something clearly for the first time. He looked at her. "You won't need to," he said. Quiet. Even. No edge he had to sharpen. He flagged the waiter, settled his bill, his own, specifically his, stood, nodded to the table with the same ease he'd carried all evening, and left. The night air outside was cool. He stood at his car for a moment before getting in, not dramatic about it, just breathing. A man finishing a sentence that had been going on for 11 months. The drive home was not what he expected. He had braced for something to hit him, grief or anger, or the particular humiliation of replaying it on a loop. Instead, there was just the road, and the radio on low, and a strange, provisional quiet settling somewhere in his chest. He thought about staying. That version of him, the one who would have laughed along, touched her arm, smoothed it over in the parking lot afterward, accepted an apology that would have been framed as a joke. He knew that version well. Had kept him around for almost a year. He was glad he'd left him at the restaurant. At home, he made tea. He didn't drink, and sat on the couch without turning on the television. He wasn't thinking about her exactly. He was thinking about himself, about the specific kind of loyalty that shades into self-erasure so gradually you don't notice the crossing. He had thought it was love. It had been, partly. But part of it had also been the habit of making himself smaller, so she could be larger, and calling that generosity. He was 31 years old, and he had been very generous. Her best friend's name was Camille. They had met a handful of times, dinners, a birthday, one afternoon that ran long into evening, when Nadia had been caught in traffic and Camille and Daniel had talked for 2 hours about things neither of them mentioned again. He had liked her. He got the sense she had paid attention to him in a way Nadia sometimes didn't. The message came that evening, around 9. "I want you to know, I didn't laugh, and I'm sorry I didn't say something at the table. I should have. He read it twice. Then, she's talked about you, Daniel, when you're not there. I think you should know that it hasn't always been kind. He set the phone down, picked it up, read it again. There was a version of himself that would have needed details, names, instances, the specific vocabulary of his own diminishment. He noticed he didn't need them. The outline was enough. He had suspected, in the way you suspect things you don't want to confirm, that he existed differently in his absence than in his presence, that the Daniel she showed him was not entirely the Daniel she described to others. He typed back, "Thank you for telling me." That was all. He didn't forward it, didn't save it somewhere strategic. He simply knew, and let knowing be enough. He had applied for the position in February. It wasn't a reckless decision. It wasn't even a particularly dramatic one. His company had a division expanding into a different city. Not a transfer exactly, more of an elevation, a role that would have represented a significant and visible shift in his career. He had applied quietly, the way he did most things, and then put it out of his mind because waiting had never suited him. He found out on a Thursday. His manager called him into her office in the mid-afternoon, and within 6 minutes, Daniel knew that the February application had worked, that the position was his if he wanted it, and that the timeline was sooner than he'd anticipated. He sat with it for a moment after she finished speaking. Then he said yes. He did not call Nadia from the parking lot. He did not text anyone. He drove home, made dinner, and for the first time in 4 days felt something that wasn't grief or clarity or the particular exhaustion of emotional aftermath. He felt, quietly and without fanfare, like himself. He doesn't know exactly how she found out. These things travel, especially through the particular ecosystem of mutual acquaintances and shared social circles that Nadia cultivated with the care of someone who understood their value. By the weekend, she had called. He answered. She sounded different. Not apologetic exactly. Nadia was rarely exactly apologetic, but recalibrated. She asked how he was. He said fine. She asked about the new role, confirming she knew. He said yes. There was a pause. She said, "I didn't think," and then she stopped. He waited. She didn't finish the sentence. Maybe she couldn't find the right ending. Maybe she realized partway through that whatever she hadn't thought wasn't something she could now reframe into something flattering. He said gently, "I know." Another silence. They spoke for a few more minutes about things that didn't matter, the logistical surface of a relationship already over, and then said goodbye with the exhausted civility of two people who had once meant something to each other and were now managing the distance between that meaning and the present. He hung up and washed the dishes. There are things he still doesn't know. He doesn't know what she said about him exactly, to which friends, in which register, on which evenings when he wasn't there to be present or to defend. He doesn't know if she was aware of the cruelty in the restaurant or if it was casual, the kind of careless contempt that doesn't even know itself as contempt. He doesn't know if she was unhappy with him or, simply, quietly, ashamed of something she never articulated. He suspects she doesn't know either. That's the thing about patterns. The people inside them rarely narrate them clearly, even to themselves. They simply act, and the action accumulates into a story, and by the time someone reads the story, it's already over. He read it. He left. He doesn't feel victorious about it. Victory implies a contest, and he doesn't think that's what this was. It was more like a door he finally walked through, after standing in the frame for almost a year, one hand on each side. Camille sent one more message, about 2 weeks later. She asked if I'd spoken to you. I said yes. She didn't ask what we talked about. He thought about that for a while. Then, how are you doing? He wrote back, better than I expected. You? She said, relieved, I think. For you. He smiled at that. A real one, the uncalculated kind. He didn't read anything into it. He didn't have to. Some things could simply be what they were. A person who saw him clearly and said so at the right moment. That was enough. He moves to the new city in 6 weeks. He hasn't told many people. There isn't a dramatic send-off to orchestrate, no public announcement to make. He told his mother, his two closest friends, the people who would notice his absence, because they paid attention to his presence. He packs a little each evening, unhurried. There are nights when the restaurant comes back to him, not the words, but the texture of the moment, the warmth of the room, the sound of laughter he didn't belong to, the specific weight of his own smile holding something in place. He doesn't return to it with bitterness. It arrives and he lets it arrive, and then it passes, the way most things pass if you don't grip them. What stays quietly is something harder to name. The knowledge that he left the right way, that he paid his bill and walked through a door and didn't look back, not because he was certain, but because certainty wasn't the point. The point was the walking. He had done that much, that for now is enough.